Sometimes in the church, we treat sexuality like a whack-a-mole game. Just deal with whatever problem pops up next. Dr. Julie Slattery proposes a better mindset.
Sexuality is not a problem for us to solve. It's a territory for us to reclaim. And if we only approach the problems of sexuality, we're never getting to the root of how do we reclaim God's design for sexuality.
This is the Revive Our Hearts podcast for June 27th, 2023. I'm Deanna Gresh. Our host is co-author of True Woman 101, Nancy DeMoss Walgemuth.
When Jesus was about to ascend to the Father, he told his disciples the Holy Spirit would empower them and that they were going to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. Here's the bottom line. The light of the gospel is needed everywhere. Well, today's guest speaker applies that concept not just to literal geographic locations, but also to those areas in our culture where darkness prevails. I don't have to remind you that we're living in an age of darkness and confusion, especially when it comes to questions of gender and sexuality. Well, Dr. Julie Slattery is about to show us how God's Word can help bring clarity to the confusion we see around us, or even sometimes in our own thinking. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that this message is for mature ears, so if you have littles around, you might want to get them occupied with something else. Julie Slattery gave this message at a recent Revive Our Hearts event. Let's listen.
My task now is to talk to you all about two words that may feel very odd to put together: sexual discipleship. When you hear those two words, I found that people usually have one of two responses. Either they're like, ew, or they're like, huh? You know, we are so used to separating God and sex that it almost feels sacrilegious to put those two words together. But I want to share with you how I came to use those two words quite regularly. As I've mentioned, over the last decade, my work has been leading a ministry where we talk about sexual issues all day, every day. That's what we do. We really sexually disciple. And so when I first began this work, I co-founded the ministry with Linda Dillow, who some of you know, and we would go all around the country to groups of women in churches, and we would talk about biblical sexuality. And one of the things that I noticed as I went from city to city and church to church was I would meet women like you who love Jesus, who have walked with the Lord for many years, who have been discipled in many ways. You had Kay Arthur under one hand and Priscilla Shirer under the other, and you knew God's word. But when it came to relating God's word to your sexuality, you're kind of like, I'm not sure how to do this. And we have not been discipled in our sexuality from the church. And what I began to realize is that we have been sexually discipled by the culture. Discipleship is not what to think about sexuality, it's how to think about sexuality. And I would say that even in my own life, having been raised in a Christian home and going to Christian colleges and graduate school, I still was very stumped in dealing with sexual issues. What does the Bible actually say about issues like masturbation and oral sex? Some of you are like, did she just say that? That just shows you how uncomfortable we are having a Christian gathering when we acknowledge the reality of these things. And so as I began to press deeper into what does it look like for us to really integrate God's word into this very private, precious area of our humanity, this idea of sexual discipleship really kept coming to the forefront of my mind. Now, in order for you to really understand what sexual discipleship is, it's helpful to look at what it's not. When we look at the ways that the church has traditionally approached sexuality, and I would say even the ways we approach it today, we are not discipling. When we look at the average Christian home, we are not discipling related to our sexuality. The approaches that we are taking, or that we've learned to take, are usually one of three. The first one is silence. How many of you would say that growing up maybe you grew up in the church, maybe you grew up in a Christian home, like this was never talked about? Many of you would raise your hands. When I put on Facebook the question, what did you learn about sex growing up in the church? Half of the responses were nothing, just nothing. We never talked about it. We just, don't have sex before marriage. That was all we heard. The silence was deafening. And because of the silence, the enemy has had room to step in and fill that void and to take up the conversation about sexuality in our own hearts. Because of the silence, we feel shame to even say out loud some of the things that we're wrestling with or struggling with. And so silence is not the right approach. A second approach that I see very often in the church today is the problem-solving approach. And I call this the whack-a-mole approach. And so your average pastor is like, we got a problem with pornography. Let's start a men's group. Boom, whack-a-mole. We got a problem with women in pornography. Let's start a women's group. Boom. We got a problem with survivors. Let's start a group. A prodigal group. All these groups rising up, which, friends, those are good. I would say those are part of discipleship, but those are only a part. Sexuality is not a problem for us to solve. It's a territory for us to reclaim. And if we only approach the problems of sexuality, we're never getting to the root of how do we reclaim God's design for sexuality. Now, the third approach, which I think we're all very comfortable with, is sex education. You've heard of sex education, right? Okay. And so Christian families will do the kinds of things like Mike and I did with our boys. We take them away for the weekend. We send our youth group, on a retreat to talk about sexual purity. We maybe have a class for engaged couples, and we give them one lesson on what to expect on their wedding night, as if one lesson will actually be helpful. But an educational approach is very limited. So let me give an example of this. In high school and college, I took Spanish. I took Spanish 4 years of high school and then 2 years in college, and even my last Spanish class was conversational Spanish. And so my final exam was to have a 15-minute conversation with my professor in Spanish only, and somehow I made it through. Well, that was quite a few years ago, but that was education. My education ended, I stopped studying Spanish, and many years later, I'm not so good at Spanish. And I asked a friend to come up. Is she here? Is Betsy here? There she is. And she's getting a microphone because Betsy actually does speak Spanish. And so she is going to test me after many years, and we are going to have a conversation in Spanish to see what I actually remember.
Hola amiga, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, ¿y tú?
Estoy muy bien. Estaba pensando preguntarte, ¿cuál es tu versículo bíblico favorito?
Yo no sé. ¿Y tú?
Ok. Me encanta el libro de los Colosenses. Y entonces, ¿cuál es tu comida favorita?
¿Dónde está el baño?
Ok, mejor te pregunto, ¿cuál es tu película favorita?
I have no idea. All right, so how did I do? Not too well, huh?
You've got like maybe 10.
10?
Out
Okay.
of 100.
I would fail. Thank you, Betsy. Thanks so much. Okay, so she is fluent in Spanish. She's been discipled in Spanish. It's a native language for her. I am not. I have been educated. And friends, this is so often how we feel when we're engaging on topics of sexuality. We have learned certain verses that we can say. We can answer the right question. If you ask it the right way, we know how to respond because we heard somebody talk about it or we read a book. But we're not fluent in biblical sexuality. And so we've gotten caught. You've gotten caught off guard by your kids, by your grandkids, by your coworkers, by your culture. We do not know what to say. And so God is calling us to do better than the culture in discipleship around sexuality. It is our place, not just to do a sermon series or not just to read one book on sexuality, but to become fluent in reclaiming the territory of biblical sexuality. Now, I will tell you that I still have great difficulty in describing to a stranger what my job is. When they ask me, I don't say, well, I sexually disciple Christians. But I have to remember that answering that question is even more difficult for my 3 sons. What does your mom do? And now that Mike works with me, they can't even talk about what Dad does. So we're both in the business of apparently sexual discipleship. So what does sexual discipleship actually look like? I'm going to give you 3 things that I have learned through the 10 years of ministry that we do to sexually disciple. And this is just an overview. The first thing is we have to be able to talk openly about sex, about all sexual issues. We have adopted through tradition this idea that Christians should not talk about sex. And let me just say, that may be a Christian tradition, but it's not a biblical one. When we read God's word, he was not shy to talk about every sexual issue. As a matter of fact, we now know that modern translators translated the Song of Solomon in a way that kind of played down the actual language that was used in Song of Solomon because they were too embarrassed to put it in the scripture. And it's not just Song of Solomon, it's all throughout Scripture. We read graphic examples of sexual brokenness and trauma and hurt and redemption. And so we have to break the silence. And ladies, I know that's difficult for many of you. It has been difficult for me. I certainly didn't tell my high school guidance counselor that I wanted to be God's voice on sexuality. The first few times I talked publicly about sex, I literally had hives crawling up my neck. I didn't think I could get through it. But we have to step into what God calls us into. And it really begins to open the conversation about sexuality. It begins with our homes, it begins with our churches. And let me just tell you, you don't have to do this perfectly. We have to be willing to do something poorly before we learn to do it well. And so if you feel like you're stumbling and you don't know what to say, if you're afraid that a woman will ask you a question that you don't know how to answer, that's okay. It's okay to say, I don't know the answer, but can I just pray with you? It is a shame that Christian women have to pay a counselor because that's the only safe place she has to talk about what she's dealing with in her sexuality. That is our work within the body of Christ. And we need to grow comfortable talking about every issue related to sexuality so that we can reclaim that ground. The second aspect of sexual discipleship is that we have to reclaim the biblical narrative of sexuality. Now, what do I mean by the biblical narrative? A narrative is what explains the why. Now, all of us growing up, and if you have had little children, you know this, around the age of 3, we start asking the question, why? We ask why about everything. So little kids, Mommy, why do I have to eat broccoli? It's yucky. Why do I have to go to bed before the sun goes down? And as our kids get older, their whys get bigger. Mom, why can't I drive the car? Mom, why can't I go to the party? And what do we do when we're really tired and we don't want to deal with the why questions? We all know the word. What do we say? Because I said so, right? That's it. Now, what happens when you're raising your kids if you always just respond with, because I said so? Your children never grow. They never mature. They never learn to think for themselves. Well, there are a lot of why questions about sexuality in the Christian faith. Why would God say it's wrong for 2 women to get married if they love each other? Why would God say that sex is reserved for marriage? And you know what, unfortunately, we've done over and over again in the Christian church? Because God says so. Now, does he say so? Yes, he does. But he also created us with people who want to know the why. And I've learned over the last decade of studying the scripture that there is an answer to the why question related to biblical sexuality. And it's a story. The Bible isn't a list of rules, even though it has rules in it. The Bible is not the law. That's not the whole thing. And Mary began to talk about this in the beginning of our time together. She talked about how the Bible is really a story that reveals God, and all of creation reveals God. And she mentioned that male and female actually have the gospel written in them. Can I go a step further and say that your sexuality tells the story of the gospel? Now, where do I get that from? Well, first of all, we need to realize that everything God created, he created for the purpose of revealing himself. And that is true of our human experiences. So, how many of you have ever felt hungry before? Some of you aren't raising your hands. You need to try fasting. How many of you have ever felt thirsty before? Okay? Because you have felt hungry and thirsty, you now know what it means when Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness." You also understand why it was so significant when Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." When he said to the woman at the well, "I am the living water. If you drink of me, you'll never get thirsty again." If you didn't have the experience of hunger and thirst physically, you wouldn't understand the spiritual. And the same is true with our sexuality. God has created us as sexual people because through our sexuality, he is revealing to us the nature of how he loves with covenant love. And we see this all throughout the Bible. Most often, sexuality is not referenced just in terms of what to do and not do. The Bible most often, in both the Old Testament and New Testament, references sexuality as a metaphor. So think about the nation of Israel with whom God had a what? A covenant, right? God had a covenant with them. And when they were unfaithful to their covenant, what did God call them through the prophets? Like an unfaithful wife. He said, "You are a prostitute. You're acting like a whore." The sexual communicated the spiritual reality of the importance of faithfulness and covenant. And in the New Testament, the covenant is with Christ and the church, and there's all this bridal language of Jesus being the bridegroom and us being the bride and the wedding feast of the Lamb. Paul says it very clearly in Ephesians chapter 5 when he's talking about marriage and the one flesh union between a husband and wife. He says, this is a mystery, and it's meant to reveal Christ and the church. Now, ladies, I know if this is the first time you've really heard somebody say that the gospel is written in our sexuality, that is like, ooh, I got to get my mind around that. And I have spent probably 5 years trying to get my mind around it. So it's okay, Paul calls it a mystery too, but I would encourage you to go deeper with the story, the narrative of biblical sexuality. The narrative explains the why. It gives purpose to even the spiritual battle around our sexuality. The third thing we need to do in sexual discipleship is we need to invite people on a journey, a lifelong journey of sexual integrity. Now, what do I mean by that? Very commonly, if we look at the language of the church around sexuality, the phrase that we've often used is sexual purity. Now, sexual purity is not a bad phrase. There's a lot of conversation in our day and age about purity culture, and I'm not going to get into that today. There's a place to talk about purity, but it has become very confusing for people, and here's why. Most of us understand sexual purity only in terms of our actions, only in terms of, for many of us, we were told to save sex for marriage. And a lot of our conversations around biblical sexuality in the church today are about actions. And when we look back at Romans chapter 1, I talked about that progression of sexual chaos. The only thing we're talking about today in our day and age in Christianity is to change that behavior. We're not teaching people how to challenge the thinking of the world that we've just ingested. We're not talking about how you can change your desires or what discernment actually looks like. And so integrity, this idea of sexual integrity, is more than just actions. And some of you can relate to this. You became a Christian, and then you said there was this long, messy period of, okay, I'm here, I know I should be here, but I have no idea how to get there. And sometimes you begin with action. All right, I'm just going to fake it till I make it. I know the church is telling me I shouldn't dress like this. I know the church is telling me I should break up with my boyfriend or with my girlfriend. I know the church is telling me that I'm supposed to stop looking at porn. I know the church is telling me that I'm supposed to enjoy sex with my husband. But if you really want to know the truth, I don't know how to do those things. How do I do them? Does all this just come naturally? No, it doesn't. It's a journey. And the journey of sexual integrity is this lifelong surrendering of every aspect of who we are to the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so many of you, even as you're listening to all of this content today, you have questions. You have questions like, my husband left me because he decided he was gay, or he decided that he was a woman. What do I do? You have questions like, I know I'm supposed to enjoy sex in my marriage, but can I be honest? I hate sex. Or the only way I know how to be aroused sexually is to think about things I know I shouldn't be thinking about. What do I do? Some of you single women are asking the question, what is the purpose of my sexual desire as a single? Does God see me? You may say, I know I'm supposed to stop looking at pornography, but I don't know how to. I can go a month or two and I have victory, but then I fall back into it. And I just wonder, am I really saved? And does God love me? And when is this going to stop? These are the questions of sexual discipleship. And it's not enough for us to bring you to the cross and salvation and repentance and tell you what your life should look like without walking with you on the road of how does this work? How do we surrender? How do we actually become the people of God? I told you that we weren't going to stop with Romans chapter 1. And what I want to look at now is what I believe is a parallel passage to Romans chapter 1 that Paul writes further later in the book of the letter of Romans. And it's found in Romans chapter 11 and 12. And what Paul is really calling us to is to leave the Romans 1 lifestyle and to be discipled into a whole different way, not just of behavior, but of thinking and of desire and of discernment. I'm going to start reading at the end of Romans chapter 11 and then go into Romans 12. And in Romans chapter 11, it's almost like Paul is writing this letter and he just has to stop and worship God. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his path is beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay them? For from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. And so instead of denying God, Paul gives us an example of what it looks like to worship God. But then let's see what happens next. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, which is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. It's good and pleasing and perfect will. And so it begins with worship. In Romans chapter 1, we saw that our thinking becomes foolish and depraved. Our hearts become darkened. Our desires are twisted. We lose our discernment. But see the reversal here? What happens when we truly worship God? Our thinking is transformed. Our desires are changed. Now we can discern God's good and perfect will. And then if we keep reading in Romans chapter 12, we see this beautiful fruit of the kind of world that we all want to live in, where we have unity and we love each other well, and we treat each other with kindness, and we cling to what is good and hate what is evil. This is discipleship, and it must, my friends, be connected to the sexual journey. It must intentionally be integrated into the struggles and questions that we have related to sexuality. Now, some of you honestly are saying, I am so glad that God raised up people like Julie Slattery to do this kind of work. You go, girl, amen. Where do I write the check? I'm with you. But I could never do that. Friend, this is not just my work. This is our work. Ephesians chapter 4 says that the only way the body of Christ becomes mature is if everyone is using their gifts under the authority of Jesus Christ. Is the Christian church mature in our understanding of sexuality? Or are we blown and tossed by every wind of culture? I think you would all agree with me in saying we are not mature. And so what is it going to take? It's going to take God's people being willing. I remember way back in the days when I was little, I would go to church, and do you remember Missionary Sunday? When you'd have a missionary come up from India or Africa, and they might tell a story like, I remember telling God I'd go anywhere but Africa, and lo and behold, God gives me a heart for Africa. Some of you are saying, I'll do anything but talk about sex. Be careful. I think I was probably there one day. You know, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And when we look at Jesus' call to go into all the world and make disciples, there is no doubt that he was talking about the geographical places that were forsaken in the world, into every corner of the world. But I also believe that he's calling us to go to the forsaken areas of the human heart. And sexuality is certainly one of them. Rosario said that you may be called to be this missionary. We are all called to be this missionary. We are all called to disciple. If you want to see a harvest, a field that is ripe for the harvest, it's the area of sexuality. People are dying for someone just to put their arm around them and to speak truth and to listen and to have compassion and to walk with them. And they have so much grace if you do it because they're like, no one else is doing it. Like, it's an amazing mission field just to see God bring forth fruit. And friend, it's a mission field that God is calling all of us to. Will you say yes? Will you be courageous enough to say, God, send me? I love the fact that we have not only teaching here today, but we have examples of what happens when Christians are bold enough to disciple and to walk alongside the hurting.
Julie Slattery has been helping us see how we can help others along in their journey of sexual integrity. You know, Nancy, I find that the way she says things are so helpful. Sometimes when I listen to Julie, I say, I never thought about it quite that way before.
I get that. She really makes us think. And she does that in her books, too. Even that term, sexual discipleship, helps us view a topic that can sometimes feel awkward or embarrassing to talk about in a healthy way. It's one of the concepts Julie covers in greater detail in her book, Rethinking Sexuality. This month, we'd love to send you a copy in appreciation for your donation of any size to help support Revive Our Hearts.
Yep, and you can give when you visit reviveourhearts.com, or you might prefer to call 1-800-569-5959. Again, that's 1-800-569-5959.
And when you make a donation, be sure you request Rethinking Sexuality by Dr. Julie Slattery. And thank you so much for your support. We truly could not continue with our various outreach efforts here at Revive Our Hearts without your prayers, your encouragement, and your donations. We appreciate it all so much.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, tomorrow on Revive Our Hearts, we're going to look at another area where there's often confusion in our culture. The whole area of children and parenting. But thankfully, God's clear about his thoughts on it. Nancy will take us to Psalm 127 and encourage us to leave a godly legacy. Please be back for Revive Our Hearts. Revive Our Hearts with Nancy DeMoss Walgemuth wants to help you find freedom, fullness, and fruitfulness.